Ocean's Silent Sentinel. This is Sentinel Station Aurora. It wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was a gamble against nature. Planted 80 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia, it stood as a lonely watcher in the icy Atlantic, battered by howling winds and relentless waves. Life aboard was no calm post. Men endured constant fear, fear of the elements, fear of failure, and fear of being forgotten. This is the haunting story of Sentinel Station Aurora. Viewer discretion is advised. In the early 1960s, with tensions between NATO allies and Soviet forces peaking, the Atlantic had become a chessboard of silent war. Fearing stealth submarine launches and long-range nuclear missiles, Canadian and US forces rushed to deploy early warning systems, not just radar towers on land, but floating stations in no man's sea. Sentinel Station Aurora was their boldest creation. Engineered to detect undersea movement and skyward threats, it combined sonar, radar, and experimental surveillance tech, all on a single sea platform. Built in Halifax and transported piece by piece, Aurora's structure mirrored offshore oil rigs, but with triple the weight and double the risk. Plunged 170 feet into icy black water, its steel legs held a platform the size of 2 hockey rinks, topped with domes, dishes, and dorms. But as with many Cold War projects, design met dread. From day one, Aurora creaked against the waves. Structural flaws surfaced. One sonar module flooded. A backup generator shorted during a winter storm. Crew members whispered that the tower was cursed. Still, it remained online, its scanners sweeping endlessly, until the day the ocean came to collect its debt. Steel Storm Sanctuary. The towers had to include everything a crew might need to survive: food, water, fuel, sleeping quarters, all in isolation, suspended over endless ocean. Once Sentinel Station Aurora was anchored in place, the trouble began. While divers secured its legs to the seabed, a brutal gale rolled in, hammering the steel frame and snapping a key support brace clean off. These braces, thick steel beams crisscrossing between the legs, were vital. Without them, the structure was exposed to every shove from the sea. The Navy scrambled to fix the damage underwater, clamping massive steel collars around the fractured stubs. But these fixes were crude, temporary, and worst of all, ineffective. Divers soon discovered the nightmare up close: bolts missing, wrong sizes forced into oversized holes, many so loose they could be pulled out by hand. Still, the mission pressed on. Huge rubber radar domes were hoisted onto the deck, housing sensitive Cold War-era electronics, and despite its groans and lurches, the tower went operational. But working on Aurora was a different kind of torture. Air Force recruiters advertised it as a floating vacation: great food, movies every night, ocean views. What they didn't mention were the constant vibrations from radar, the haunting metal moans echoing up from the ocean, or the creeping madness known as tower fever. After weeks surrounded by nothing but gray skies, wind, and steel, the men realized this wasn't a mission. It was a slow descent into isolation, far beyond the point of rescue. Cracked cold command. Helicopter flights to Sentinel Station Aurora were so risky that they always came in pairs. One would attempt to land, while the other hovered nearby, ready to rescue if things went south. But when the weather turned bad, which it often did, no one came at all. And then there was the donut, a crude, terrifying contraption made from an old aircraft tire inner tube, dangled from a crane high above the ocean. Boarding meant grabbing on, holding tight, and praying not to be hurled into the waves below. Even seasoned crews hated it. Still, morale-boosting efforts were real. Makeshift hobby corners, barbecue nights, rationed beer, and actual movie screenings. But none of it could drown out the endless mechanical hum or the deafening foghorn, the loudest ever built, which roared every 29 seconds during heavy fog. Sleep was scarce. Tower Aurora had been engineered to withstand 125-mile-per-hour winds and 35-foot waves. but even a fraction of that made it sway like a drunk giant. Unlike the shallower towers, Aurora sat deep and moved constantly, never stable, never still. It was soon dubbed Old Shaky. By 1961, the radar tower's purpose had already become obsolete. Designed to detect low-flying Soviet bombers, it couldn't keep up with intercontinental missiles screaming through the atmosphere. Still, the tower remained manned, not for defense, but to keep Soviet ships from salvaging classified tech. The crew was cut to 28, half airmen, half repair contractors. Their mission now wasn't surveillance, but survival. Hurricane Isla sealed Aurora's fate. In September 1960, the monster storm slammed the station with 132-mile-per-hour winds and 50-foot waves, forces far beyond anything it had been built to endure. And just like that, the end began. Final storm warning. When Hurricane Isla passed, Sentinel Station Aurora was still upright, but barely. Post-storm inspections revealed that the underwater bracing had cracked and shifted, slashing the tower's structural strength nearly in half. It had become a death trap held together by rust and hope, yet it stayed manned. And the horrifying part? Everyone on board knew it wasn't safe. They didn't need divers or official reports. They could feel it. The creaks were louder, the swaying sharper, the joke among crew: never shave with a straight razor, not unless you want to bleed out when Old Shaky lurches. Humor was their only armor against dread. The constant vibrations from radar, diesel engines, and the ocean below now felt more violent than ever. Captain Elias Munro, the man in charge of Aurora, saw the writing on the wall. He sent repeated evacuation requests up the chain of command. Everyone was denied. Headquarters was still more afraid of Soviet salvage than structural collapse. Then came January 17th. Captain Raul Vargas, commander of the Navy supply ship Tidebreaker, radioed a warning to Munro. Bad weather was forming fast. If they wanted out, they needed to act immediately. But Munro still lacked the authority to evacuate. That remained with command officers far inland. By the evening of January 18th, a severe weather advisory warned of wind speeds up to 69 miles per hour. The crew had seen this before. Just days earlier, Aurora had ridden out similar conditions. But by the next morning, January 19th, the storm had deepened. When Munro was asked if he feared the worst, he replied calmly, "It didn't matter. Helicopters couldn't fly. The donut wouldn't survive the waves. The window to leave had slammed shut." That afternoon, around 1 p.m., Munro made a final call to his wife. He said the tower was moving worse than ever, and if it went down, they wouldn't survive. There'd be no rescue, just the Atlantic. Then, at 3:30 p.m., the forecast worsened, gusts up to 86 miles per hour. At 4 p.m., Munro radioed Otis Base. A loud crack had rung out. The tower was swaying violently. Permission to evacuate finally came through, but it was too late. Helicopters were grounded. Navy and Coast Guard ships were launched, but they were still hours away. Aurora and her 28 men were already caught in the storm. Collapse in silence. At 6 p.m., with the wind howling at over 98 miles per hour and waves reaching an impossible 35 feet high, Captain Gordon Munro made another call to his wife. His voice, usually steady, was strained. The tower, he said, was swaying violently. Below him, his crew, 28 men, both airmen and civilian contractors, worked feverishly, tossing safes, top-secret files, and any sensitive documents overboard. It was a desperate bid to ensure nothing classified would survive if they didn't. The ocean was already claiming the tower inch by inch, but they clung to protocol. The fear wasn't just of the sea, it was of Soviet hands reaching in through the wreckage. Then, at 6:45 p.m., the final distress call from Sentinel Station Aurora cracked through the static of the radio. It was short, grim. The tower was breaking apart. 15 minutes later, Munro radioed Captain Raul Vargas aboard the Navy supply ship Tidebreaker. His message was simple and final: get the ship to safety, now. Vargas hesitated, torn between duty and survival, but ultimately he obeyed, turning his vessel around. He watched the radar screen, tracking the Aurora's blip until 7:28 p.m. when it vanished completely. Sentinel Station Aurora had collapsed into the North Atlantic, swallowed by the cold, dark water. All 28 souls aboard were lost. Only 2 bodies would ever be recovered. The tragedy echoed across the country, from the icy Atlantic to the echoing halls of Congress. At Otis Air Force Base, where Aurora had been managed and monitored, the response was swift but cold. A board of inquiry convened within hours, and fingers pointed in every direction. Early findings uncovered something infuriating. In the days leading up to the storm, Captain Monroe had, in fact, been granted the authority to evacuate the tower at his own discretion, but no one had told him. He had been begging for clearance he technically already had. The Air Force scrambled to contain the fallout. Charges were brought. A colonel at the Boston Air Defense Sector was charged with involuntary manslaughter. 2 other officers faced dereliction of duty. It seemed for a moment like accountability was on the table, but by summer, the charges began to vanish. In June, the top brass had their charges dropped. In August, the court-martial board dismissed the case entirely. Just like that, it was over. No one was held responsible. No one served time. The message was chillingly clear. Mistakes were made, but somehow no one had made them. Families of the 28 dead men were left stunned, betrayed not just by the collapse of the tower, but by the system that followed. Before the military could bury the issue completely, the Senate stepped in. Their hearings were sharper, more damning. They named names, pulled no punches. Human error was at the heart of the disaster, a failure of leadership, engineering, and oversight. The Navy took a beating for its role in supervising construction and maintenance. But the most shocking revelation came from the seabed itself. Tower 2, one of the more stable platforms, had its legs driven 48 feet, over 15 meters, into solid ocean floor. Tower 4, just 18 feet. That's less than half, and it was stationed in deeper, far rougher waters. The structure was doomed from the beginning, built like a high-rise on soft sand, then left to battle the fury of the North Atlantic alone. Civilian observers were left with a question no one could answer. How did a structure built to save lives end up causing so much death? The truth was brutal. Aurora was outdated before it ever fell. Built to spot Soviet bombers flying low and slow, it became useless the moment missiles replaced planes. By 1961, the radar tower that once promised a 60-minute early warning couldn't even give 30 seconds. But still, it was manned, not for strategy, but out of fear the Soviets might scoop it up. It was better, commanders said, to risk 28 lives than lose a radar array. That mindset is what doomed Sentinel Station Aurora. And when it sank, the legal reckoning was weak. Careers were quietly shuffled. Commanders were reassigned. The headlines faded. Today, the wreckage of Aurora lies 185 feet below the surface of the Atlantic. It's not a war memorial. It's not even marked. But it's there, rusting, fragmented, and colonized by sea life. Divers with enough skill and courage can find it, but what they'll see is more than twisted steel. They'll see a monument to everything that went wrong. They'll see a Cold War relic that carried the weight of fear, secrecy, and failure on its beams. They'll see the grave of 28 men who weren't soldiers in combat, but were lost in the gray, bureaucratic fog of military neglect. For years, the Texas towers, Aurora included, faded into memory. Better technology took their place. The Cold War shifted. The radar towers were quietly decommissioned. But Tower 4, or Aurora as we've called it in this telling, left a scar. The men who died out there weren't heroes in some celebrated battle. They weren't remembered in grand speeches or parades. They were doing their jobs, following orders, trusting the steel beneath their feet was solid. That someone, somewhere, had checked the bolts and signed the papers and done the math right, but no one had. And in the end, they died for it. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you have a story suggestion, there's a submission form linked in the description. And if you'd like to support this kind of work, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember the ones lost not in war, but in silence.